Over the years, applying principles of soil health, applying practices from regenerative agriculture has marked a dramatic shift in our farm. What was once a lifeless clay soil, made productive only because of costly inputs like synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides, is slowly becoming rich with organic matter and building soil health and soil life. We've been moving away from costly inputs like fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, toward harnessing more natural systems that sustain and build themselves. Rather than sending our farm's resources, like sun, water, air, to distant factories in the form of livestock, we now use those same resources to help build soil health and nourish our family and our customers' families as well. I'm Rod from Dowdle Family Farms, and in this video I want to discuss the ways we've used to help improve soil health and how we've moved to different ways that are more productive, less labor intensive, and allow us to improve the soil health on our farm in a larger scale with less time, energy, and costly equipment. And maybe it'll help you improve your soil health as well. The soils on our farm are in varying stages of soil health. The worst performing fields on our farm tend to be compacted, wet, acidic. They have little organic matter, little soil life, and horrible soil texture. Years ago, my dad tried to improve some of the worst performing soils on our farm by adding tons of lime per acre, lots of fertilizer, and seeding them with grasses and legumes. But they underperformed, and he spent thousands of dollars trying to create good pasture out of those worst performing soils. He would spray them and try to grow the more productive grasses and weed out the less productive grasses and weeds, but it wasn't very effective. Finally, we just started grazing what grew there naturally, and it's improved a little bit. Historically, this field has been underperforming because water would just sit on top of the ground in the lower areas, and it would take days and days for just a couple inches of water to penetrate into the soil. And those aren't the best conditions for growing productive forages. For over a decade now, I've tried various ways of improving different soil types. Before I moved back to our farm here in Mississippi, I had a small market garden in our backyard. I had free access to tons and tons of good, rich compost that I applied liberally, and it worked beautifully. We grew wonderful carrots, broccoli, greens, lettuces, tomatoes, beans, peas, and many other crops that we sold commercially. However, when I moved back to the farm, I found that was incredibly difficult to do on our worn out clay soils, especially when I didn't have access to tons and tons of free compost. I tried dozens of different methods to improve our soil health, from using leaves, wood chip, coffee grounds, and whatever compost I could find, and then decided to try using poultry. The nitrogen-rich manure from poultry helped improve the forages and the market gardens that we produced. But the benefits were limited, and I could only do it on a small scale. To truly make an impact, I would have had to have created a market for thousands and thousands of chickens and hundreds of dozens of eggs per day. You see, I fell into a trap that is very common for a lot of new people starting out to increase their soil health. I wanted to stop using fertilizers, so I thought I needed more nitrogen, which the poultry produced. While the poultry helped produce some good growth, it was just putting a patch on a larger problem. Just as importantly, I struggled to sell our products because the poultry products were 3 to 6 times the price of what people could pay in a conventional system. While people wanted a premium product, that additional cost was incredibly difficult for them to pay. The methods that I had used before worked beautifully on small plots of land. But if I were going to increase the soil health, increase the organic matter, and improve the soil on our farm on a larger scale, I was going to have to find different methods. I'd heard a lot about cover crops, and we were trying to reduce any kind of fertilizer inputs on the farm, partially because we didn't have money for them. So I focused on trying to grow cover crops that would make up for that loss of nitrogen. So I started interseeding clovers and legumes in our pastures. I took a small hand spreader and walked around acres and acres and acres of pasture, broadcasting Durana clover and crimson clover those first couple years. That helped a lot. When our supply of wood chips ran out and I realized that going to get bags of leaves and bring them to the farm was a lot of work that didn't always pay for itself, I knew I needed to find a way to produce more carbon-based materials on our farm to improve the soil. So I decided to try sorghum sudan grass that is a prolific, tall-growing grass. It could produce 10 to 12 tons of dry matter per acre in one growing season. Without any other equipment, I took the 4-foot tiller behind my small tractor and tilled up almost an acre's worth of ground and planted that cover crop. It grew so fast that I couldn't mow it, so I put cows in there to graze it. And boy, did they perform well on that grass. In our garden beds, I tried flail mowing the cover crop so that we'd get even more productivity out of it, and it helped improve soil health as well. The following year, I expanded the area where I grew that sorghum sudan grass, and shortly after I planted it, we had a several-week-long dry spell. You can see the clear lines of where I had expanded the sorghum sudan grass growth because it was starting to dry out, but where I had grown sorghum sudan grass the year before, we got 2 to 3 more weeks of growth before it started drying out. Much to my parents' distress, that's when we got our first pigs. I grazed the pigs over winter where the sorghum sudan grass had grown, and I hauled thousands of bags of leaves from town. It was labor intensive, but it worked. Their manure, urine, and rooting action helped break the leaves down, improving the soil in that few thousand square feet. While it made a difference in the short term, this method wasn't very sustainable because of the labor involved. I knew I needed to do something different. Bringing tons of carbon-based materials, even compost, to the farm can make a huge impact. But if I was going to do it on many acres, not just one, I needed to find a more efficient way. Rebuilding soil on more than 300 acres by continuously bringing in carbon was labor-intensive, unsustainable, and would take a century or more. Now, we'd had cows since I was a kid, and we had started doing some rotational grazing with those cows. But the farm wasn't set up to be the most efficient at rotational grazing our cows. And over the years, we fed a lot of hay, and we would use the hay as a way of jump-starting soil life on some of those underperforming pastures. And then we interseeded our perennial pastures with legumes like clovers and forbs like chicory and plantain that for years we'd been spraying to kill because they were weed. But the thing that surprised me the most, and few people were talking about at the time, is how much pigs contributed to building our soil health. Now, even though the pigs root up the ground a lot and they'll leave holes if they're not managed well, their manure adds tons of organic matter to the soil. Plus, the sale of pork helped cover the cost of the grain and provided a modest profit to the farm. You see, the pork that we sold was more expensive than conventional pork, but customers were willing to pay a 25 to 50% premium over the conventional pork for our better tasting, more nutritious, pasture-raised pork. Compared to chicken, it was wonderful. Most importantly, each pig would deposit nearly half a ton of manure in just 6 months. And a small group of pigs was way easier to manage and sell and deposited more manure than poultry. And pigs have very few predator issues. To this day, I'm still experimenting with a lot of different cover crop species. But I soon discovered that cover crops helped with soil health more than just by adding nitrogen to the soil that we weren't providing in fertilizer anymore. And I continued seeding better forages in our perennial pastures. But on our worst performing pastures, like out here where our pigs are now, we weren't getting much forage growth at all. On 2 different occasions, we tried running a no-till drill to help interseed large sections of pasture, but that was wildly problematic for several reasons. A couple years ago, I bought an 8-foot disc and started planting cover crops out here on this section of pasture where our pigs are now. And we produced some decent high-quality forage on 10 acres where I planted that. On 5 acres, I kept pigs, and that performed beautifully. In fact, the 5 acres where I had the pigs performed so much better than the 10 acres where we planted the cover crops and grazed it with cows. Now, don't get me wrong, looking back, that was a very inefficient way of planting cover crops, but it was the only way I knew how at the time. And even though we got mixed results with that planting of cover crops, we still got more forage for the cows on that land than we did the previous 2 years combined. And then we planted our cool season cover crops last fall, and this winter and spring, we produced tons and tons of feed. We strip grazed them with our pigs, reduced our feed cost dramatically for several months, produced outstanding port and improved soil health in ways that we never would have imagined before. The funny thing is some people tend to view cover crops as an additional cost in their farming operations, especially if they're row crop farmers. In many ways, cover crops are expensive. Some farmers justify the expense of establishing cover crops with the savings on fertility for the following crops, and from what I gather, they can save money while building soil health. However, there are other ways to monetize cover crops. This winter, I bought a 6-foot no-till drill to pull behind my small tractor, and we've had fairly good success with it. In fact, we planted an additional 15 acres of cover crops south of Dowdle Road, where I started this video. And even though we got spotty germination because of only 3/10 of an inch of rain after I planted those crops, that was the most profitable crop we planted, and I'll explain why. We've had such a dry summer that people started feeding hay in June this year. Even though that cover crop got partial germination because of poor soil conditions, dry weather, and many other factors, we still got several weeks of grazing out of that cover crop. It's late September, and I know several people who have been feeding hay since June. If we'd had to feed hay that long, we would have spent $3,000 or $4,000 feeding hay. That $1,200 in seed and cover crops saved us a lot of money, even though it didn't get as good a germination as we expected. That saved us $2,000 to $3,000 worth of hay costs. And it built soil health a little bit. You can monetize your cover crops by grazing them with livestock, but pigs are by far the most effective way of monetizing cover crops. Let me explain. Pigs can't be grazed on just pasture alone. So we grow nutrient-rich cover crops for our pigs to graze that reduce the consumption of the grain that they feed. This chicory here not only has deep tap roots that draw up minerals from deep in the soil profile, help break up compaction, and benefit insects and wildlife as well, it's nutrient rich for our pigs. Likewise, the buckwheat that you see flowering is excellent for pig forage, as are these forage brassicas that we're growing. And while you will see some weeds intermixed in here, growing crops like this can reduce our pig feed costs between 25 and 80%, all while improving our soil. Now, to reduce our pig feed costs that much, we typically need to seed the more expensive, more nutritious cover crops. In addition to manuring our pastures, the livestock help us monetize the cover crops that build soil health. And while these cover crops have some weeds, from crabgrass to Vassey's grass to wild squashes and gourds, you can see a lot of nutritious biomass for our pigs. In the chicory, daikon radish, buckwheat, cereal rye, sorghum sudan grass, cowpeas, and other cover crops that help us save feeding costs. The real question is, how have these efforts paid off? A few days ago, I performed a water infiltration test to see how effective these different strategies have been. Even though I started many of these strategies 7 years ago under cover crops, most of the area that we currently have under cover crops and pigs has only been used for a year to year and a half. And what I found with that water infiltration test, on some areas of the farm, it took almost 30 minutes for our soil to absorb 1 inch's worth of water. But where we'd been using cover crops the most, our soils absorbed the water in as quickly as 5 minutes for 1 inch of water. That is huge, because it helps mitigate drought and flooding at the same time. There's less water running off of our farm. Frankly, it has taken a long time to produce those results. And even though I've seen a lot of improvement on the farm in the last year and a half where we've been growing cover crops and pigs, our soil has turned from this bright red clay to a darker gray. Likewise, we produced more feed out here for our cows this year than we have the previous 2 years combined. And that doesn't count the value that the pigs got out of this as well. So these efforts are making the worst performing soils on the farm more productive with fewer costs, fewer inputs, and making some long-term impact on the soils on the farm. It's just going to take more time. So what are the plans moving forward? Well, we've settled on growing cover crops for our cows and our pigs. We'll still continue to feed hay on the worst performing soils on the farm. We'll still grow cover crops on those worst performing soils on the farm. And I'll still raise pigs. Frankly, I'd raise 4,000 or 5,000 pigs a year if I had the market for them. And frankly, my focus has been on the pastured pigs. I have not been very effective at implementing rotational grazing systems for our cows. In fact, I rotate our pigs more frequently than the cows on average. Most of the time, our pigs are moved every couple of days because I've set up the infrastructure with fencing to make those moves incredibly easy. And moving pigs isn't nearly as easy as moving cows. So answer for me, what are you doing to improve the soil health on your farm? Take care and have a great day.